The largest gold deposit ever discovered was salted with shavings from wedding rings bought at a local market in Borneo. A geologist named Michael de Guzman would buy the rings from village jewelers, file them down to dust, and sprinkle the gold into rock samples before they were sent to a lab. The lab would test the samples, find gold, and report the results. The results would be published, and the stock price of a company called Bre-X Minerals would climb higher. It climbed from 27 cents to $286. The company reached a market capitalization of $6 billion. Pension funds bought in. Mining giants fought over partnership rights. The Indonesian government got involved, so did the Suharto family. All of it. Every analyst report, every broker recommendation, every retirement fund allocation was based on core samples that had been contaminated with jewelry gold by a man working in a bamboo shed in the middle of the Borneo rainforest. When the fraud was finally about to be exposed, de Guzman was riding in a helicopter over the jungle. He fell out. To understand how Bre-X happened, you have to understand Calgary in the early 1990s. Not the oil-rich Calgary of the 1970s boom, but the Calgary that existed after the bust. A city full of geologists, promoters, and speculators who had built careers on resource extraction and were now sitting in offices with nothing to extract. The Alberta oil patch had collapsed. The junior mining sector was quiet. The Vancouver Stock Exchange, which had spent decades as the penny stock capital of North America, was being cleaned up by regulators. The easy money was gone. David Walsh was a product of this world. Born in Montreal in 1945, he had spent years working as a stockbroker in the Canadian mining sector without ever producing a major success. He was a large man with a salesman's energy and a resume that raised no flags because it contained nothing worth flagging. He was not a geologist. He was not an engineer. He was a promoter, a man who raised money for exploration stage companies and lived on the margin between optimism and delusion. By the early 1990s, Walsh was broke. He had declared personal bankruptcy. He was living in the basement of his house in Calgary. He had a company called Bre-X Minerals that was listed on the Alberta Stock Exchange and was worth essentially nothing. Its shares traded for pennies when they traded at all. Walsh needed a project. Not a real project necessarily, just something that sounded plausible enough to raise a few $100,000 from private investors. Something with a story. In the junior mining world, the story was always more important than the rock. The story Walsh found was in Indonesia. In the late 1980s, a geologist named John Felderhof had been working in Southeast Asia, bouncing between projects in Australia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Felderhof was experienced. He had a geology degree from Dalhousie University in Halifax, and he had spent time with major mining companies before drifting into the world of junior exploration. He was smart enough to understand geology and optimistic enough to believe that the next discovery was always just one drill hole away. Felderhof knew Indonesia. He knew the geology of Kalimantan, the Indonesian portion of the island of Borneo, and he believed that a property called Busang in the remote interior of East Kalimantan had potential. There had been small-scale alluvial gold mining in the area for years. Local panners had been pulling gold from the rivers. The geological setting, volcanic intrusions cutting through sedimentary rock, was consistent with gold mineralization. Walsh listened. He did not understand the geology, but he understood the pitch. A gold property in the jungle, Indonesia, untouched. The kind of story that moved stock on the Alberta Exchange. In 1993, Bre-X acquired the rights to explore the Busang property. Walsh raised a small amount of capital and sent a team to begin drilling. The team's chief geologist was Michael de Guzman. De Guzman was Filipino. He had a geology degree from Adamson University in Manila and decades of field experience across Southeast Asia. He was not a theorist, he was a core sample man, someone who lived in field camps, supervised drill rigs, logged rock, and prepared samples for assay. He was also, by multiple accounts, deeply in debt. He had 4 wives, some accounts say 5. They lived in different countries. None of them knew about the others. Maintaining that arrangement required money that a field geologist working in the Borneo jungle did not have. De Guzman arrives at Busang in 1993 and begins supervising the drilling program. The property is remote. The nearest town is a long boat ride down the Mahakam River. The drill camp is accessible only by helicopter or a grueling overland trek. The core samples, cylinders of rock pulled from underground by the drill, are handled by de Guzman and a small team of local workers before being split, bagged, and sent to an independent assay lab. The first results come back. They show gold. Not traces, not marginal grades, significant gold. The kind of numbers that, if they held up across the property, would represent a world-class discovery. Felderhof publishes the results. The stock begins to move. On the Alberta exchange, Bre-X ticks up from pennies to a few dollars. More holes are drilled. More samples are sent to the lab. The results keep coming back positive. Some of the intersections show gold grades that are extraordinary, multiple grams per ton over long intervals. Professional geologists who see the data begin to talk. If these numbers are real, Busang is not just a gold deposit. It is one of the largest gold deposits on the planet. Felderhof does what any good mining promoter does with results like these. He publishes them. He presents at mining conferences. He talks to analysts. He describes Busang as a potential 30 million ounce gold resource, then 40 million ounces, then 70 million, then 100 million. The numbers keep growing because the drilling keeps expanding, and every new set of results confirms the same thing. There is gold at Busang, and there is a lot of it. By 1995, the resource estimate has climbed past 100 million ounces. By 1996, Bre-X is claiming 200 million ounces. 200 million ounces of gold at mid-1990s prices is worth more than $70 billion in the ground. If even half of that estimate is real, Busang is the largest gold discovery in the history of mining. The stock price reflects it. Bre-X moves from the Alberta Exchange to the Toronto Stock Exchange. Then it lists on NASDAQ. Shares that traded for under $1 in 1993 are now trading above 250 Canadian dollars. The market cap reaches $6 billion. Walsh, the bankrupt promoter from Calgary, is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars on paper. Felderhof is worth even more. De Guzman is wealthy too, though his money disappears into the maintenance of multiple households across multiple countries. Mining analysts at major banks issue buy recommendations. Lehman Brothers covers the stock. JP Morgan covers the stock. Pension funds in Ontario and Quebec buy shares. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, one of the largest institutional investors in Canada, takes a position. Nobody drills their own hole. The sample preparation process at Busang works like this. A drill rig bores into the ground and extracts cylinders of rock called core. The core is brought to the surface and laid out in wooden boxes in sequential order. The geologist, de Guzman, logs the core, recording the rock types, mineralization, and any visible gold. The core is then split lengthwise. One half stays in the box as a reference. The other half is crushed, pulverized into powder, and bagged for shipment to the assay lab. Between the splitting and the shipment, there is a window. The preparation facility at Busang is a basic structure. It is not a clean room. It is not monitored by cameras. It is a building in the jungle, staffed by local workers under the supervision of de Guzman and a handful of Bre-X geologists. The chain of custody from drill to lab passes through this building and through de Guzman's hands. What de Guzman does during that window is simple. He buys gold, not from a refiner or a bullion dealer, from local markets. Wedding rings, small pieces of jewellery, the kind of gold that is available in any town in Kalimantan, sold by weight at shops along the river. He files the gold into dust. He takes the dust and adds it to the crushed rock samples before they are bagged and sent to the lab. This is called salting. It is the oldest trick in mining fraud. It dates back to the 19th century, when prospectors would load a shotgun with gold dust and fire it into a rock face before inviting investors to inspect the property. The technique has not changed in 150 years. The only thing that has changed is the scale. De Guzman is not adding gold to a few samples. He is adding gold to hundreds of samples, across dozens of drill holes over a period of years. The consistency is what makes it convincing. If only one hole showed gold, any competent geologist would be suspicious. But when every hole shows gold, when the grades are consistent across the property, when the geological model hangs together, when the cross-sections make sense, the fraud becomes invisible. The gold in the samples is real gold. The lab is not making an error. When Indo-Assay Laboratories in Balikpapan tests the crushed rock, they find gold because there is gold in the sample. The lab does its job correctly. The corruption is upstream of the lab, in the space between the drill and the bag. There is one detail that a careful metallurgist would catch, but nobody is looking carefully. The gold particles in the Busang samples are rounded and smooth, alluvial gold, the kind that has been tumbled in river gravel for thousands of years. Gold that forms in hard rock deposits is angular and jagged. It has sharp edges because it crystallized in place. The Busang samples claim to come from a hard rock deposit, but the gold in them has the morphology of river gold, or jewellery gold, because jewellery gold has been melted and processed, which rounds the particles in exactly the same way that a river does. This distinction exists in the assay data. It is there for anyone who looks. But the people looking at the data are not metallurgists examining gold particle shapes under a microscope. They are stock analysts reading resource estimates in a report. They see a number, grams per tonne, and they model it in a spreadsheet. The spreadsheets say Busang is the find of the century, and the stock keeps climbing. While the stock climbs, something else is happening. The Indonesian government has noticed that a Canadian penny stock company appears to control the largest gold deposit on Indonesian soil. This is a political problem. In 1996, Indonesia is ruled by President Suharto, who has held power since 1967. The Suharto regime operates on patronage. Major natural resource projects do not proceed without the involvement of politically connected Indonesian partners. This is not corruption in the usual sense. It is the architecture of the state. If you want to mine in Indonesia, you need a Suharto-connected partner. This is understood by every mining company operating in the country. Bre-X does not have a Suharto partner. It has a small exploration concession acquired when nobody thought the property was worth anything. Now that Busang is supposedly worth $70 billion in the ground, the rules change. The Suharto government signals that Bre-X must take on an Indonesian partner. Multiple factions compete for the role. Suharto's eldest daughter, Siti Hardianti Rukmana, known as Tutut, has business interests through a company called PT Panutan Duta. Suharto's son, Sigit Harjojudanto, has his own group. Bob Hassan, a close Suharto associate and the most powerful timber baron in Indonesia, operates through his own network. Walsh flies to Jakarta. He meets with government officials. He tries to navigate the competing demands of Suharto-connected businessmen who each want a piece of Busang. He is a bankrupt stock promoter from Calgary, trying to negotiate with a military dictatorship. At the same time, the major mining companies are circling. Barrick Gold, the largest gold producer in the world at the time, makes an aggressive push to acquire Busang through a joint venture. Barrick has connections. Its advisory board includes former US President George H.W. Bush and former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The company lobbies the Indonesian government directly. Placer Dome makes a competing offer. So does Newmont Mining. The bidding war is public. It is covered in the financial press worldwide. Bre-X is at the centre of one of the largest mining deals in history. And the underlying assumption that Busang actually contains 200 million ounces of gold is accepted as fact by every party at the table. In February 1997, the Indonesian government brokers a deal. Bre-X will retain 45% of Busang. The Indonesian government will receive 40%. And Freeport McMoran, the American mining giant based in New Orleans, will acquire 15% and serve as the operator. Freeport is not Barrick. It does not have former presidents on its advisory board. But it has something more important for this story. It already operates the Grasberg mine in the Indonesian province of Papua, one of the largest gold and copper mines in the world. Freeport knows Indonesian mining, it knows Indonesian politics, and it knows what real gold deposits look like. As part of the partnership agreement, Freeport sends its own drilling team to Busang to conduct due diligence. This is the moment the fraud begins to die. Freeport's drill team arrives at Busang in March 1997 and begins drilling confirmation holes near the locations of the original Bre-X holes. If the deposit is real, the numbers should approximate the original numbers. Freeport's first results come back. They show almost nothing. Trace gold, background levels. The kind of numbers you would find in barren rock anywhere on Earth. Approximately 0.01% of what Bre-X has been reporting from adjacent holes. Freeport drills more holes. Same result. And more. Same result. The discrepancy is not marginal. It is total. Bre-X claims grams per ton. Freeport finds parts per billion. The deposit, as described by Bre-X, does not exist. Freeport contacts Bre-X. Bre-X responds that Freeport may have drilled in the wrong locations, that the geology is complex, that the gold distribution is erratic. But Freeport has not drilled one hole. It has drilled several. None of them show gold. On March 19, 1997, Michael de Guzman boards a helicopter at the Busang camp. He is flying to a meeting in Samarinda, the provincial capital of East Kalimantan. The helicopter is an Alouetta 3, operated by a local charter company. There are two other people on board, the pilot and another Bre-X employee. During the flight, de Guzman falls out of the helicopter. His body is found 4 days later in the jungle. The remains are badly decomposed. Tropical heat, insects and scavenging animals have made identification difficult. Indonesian authorities ultimately identify the body through dental records and a thumbprint comparison. but the identification is disputed by some of de Guzman's relatives. The official ruling is suicide. De Guzman left a note, reportedly referencing his hepatitis B diagnosis and his distress over the failing due diligence results. But the note is handwritten, and questions about its authenticity circulate immediately. Some facts complicate the suicide narrative. De Guzman had recently purchased life insurance. He had made travel arrangements for several of his wives. He had been diagnosed with hepatitis B, which in the mid-1990s was a manageable condition, not a death sentence. He had 4 or 5 simultaneous families to support, which is a motive for staying alive, not for jumping out of a helicopter. The conspiracy theories begin immediately and never stop. De Guzman faked his death. The body was someone else's. He was pushed. He had plastic surgery and lives in South America. None of these theories have been confirmed. What is confirmed is this: the one person who knew exactly how the fraud was committed, who did the salting, who handled the samples, who could explain the mechanics, was dead before he could be questioned. 10 days after de Guzman's death, Freeport McMoran publicly announces that its due diligence drilling at Busang has found insignificant amounts of gold. The stock does not crash immediately. Some investors believe Freeport is wrong. Some believe this is a negotiating tactic to drive down Bre-X's share price before acquiring it cheaply. The human capacity to reject information that threatens a profitable position is enormous. Then the independent audit lands. Bre-X, under pressure from the Toronto Stock Exchange and its own investors, commissions Strathcona Mineral Services, a respected independent mining consultancy, to conduct a full technical audit of Busang. Strathcona sends a team to the site. They do not drill new holes, they examine the existing core samples, the ones sitting in wooden boxes in the jungle, the reference halves that were never sent to the lab. What Strathcona finds ends the story. The core samples have been tampered with. The gold in the samples is not consistent with the host rock. The particle shapes are wrong, rounded and smooth where they should be angular. Under a scanning electron microscope, the gold grains show characteristics of alluvial or processed gold, not gold that crystallized in place within a volcanic rock. Some samples show physical evidence of tampering, material that appears to have been added after the core was split. The grain size distribution is inconsistent. The gold is concentrated at the surfaces of the crushed material in a pattern that does not occur in natural mineralization, but does occur when gold dust is sprinkled onto crushed rock. Strathcona's report, released in May 1997, concludes that the Busang samples were salted. The resource does not exist. The 200 million ounces is zero. The stock collapses. Bre-X shares, which had traded above 280 Canadian dollars, fall to pennies. The $6 billion market cap is erased. Trading is halted on the Toronto Stock Exchange. The company enters bankruptcy proceedings. The investors who lose money include some of the largest institutional funds in Canada. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan loses approximately $100 million. The Quebec Public Sector Pension Fund loses tens of millions. Individual investors across Canada, many of whom bought shares on margin, lose their homes. A class action lawsuit is filed, then another, then another. David Walsh, the promoter who started it all, denies any knowledge of the fraud. He claims he was deceived by de Guzman. He says he never visited the drill site. He says he trusted his geologists and relied on their expertise. Walsh relocates to the Bahamas with his wife Jeanette. He lives in a waterfront property purchased during the boom years. The Bahamian residence places him outside Canadian jurisdiction, which complicates the legal proceedings. In June 1998, David Walsh dies of a brain aneurysm at the age of 52. He is never charged. He never testifies. Whatever he knew about the salting, whether he ordered it or enabled it or simply chose not to see it, dies with him. John Felderhof, the chief geologist who published the resource estimates and promoted the stock, is charged by the Ontario Securities Commission with insider trading and misleading investors. The trial begins in 2000. It lasts, with interruptions, until 2007. Felderhof is acquitted on all charges. The judge rules that the prosecution failed to prove Felderhof knew the samples were salted. He had sold approximately $84 million in Bre-X shares during the boom. But selling shares is not illegal, and the prosecution could not demonstrate he sold because he knew the deposit was fake. Felderhof retires to the Cayman Islands. He later moves to the Philippines. He dies in 2019 at the age of 79. De Guzman is dead. Walsh is dead. Felderhof is acquitted. Nobody goes to prison for the largest mining fraud in history. The total losses are estimated at $3 billion. That number counts only the direct share value destroyed. It does not include the margin calls, the bankruptcies, the pension shortfalls, or the secondary damage to the Canadian mining sector, which spent years rebuilding credibility after Busang. The fraud changes the industry. The Toronto Stock Exchange and the Canadian Institute of Mining adopt National Instrument 43-101, a regulatory standard that requires mineral resource estimates to be prepared by a qualified independent geologist. It mandates specific reporting formats, requires disclosure of conflicts of interest, and creates legal liability for the qualified person who signs the report. Before Bre-X, a junior mining company could publish whatever numbers it wanted. After Bre-X, there are rules. The rules exist because a man in a bamboo shed in Borneo bought wedding rings at a local market, filed them down to dust, and sprinkled the dust into rock samples. He did this for 4 years. He did it hundreds of times. He created the illusion of 200 million ounces of gold, using a technique that was first documented in the California gold rush. The technique was never sophisticated. The trick was that nobody checked. The assay lab tested the samples correctly and found gold because there was gold to find. The analysts modeled the resource correctly using the assay results. The investors bought the stock based on the analysts' models. The pension funds allocated capital based on the investors' behavior. Each layer of the system did its job correctly. And each layer assumed that the layer beneath it had also done its job correctly. The foundation of the entire structure was a bag of crushed rock in a jungle. And the only person who touched that bag before it left the site was a man who owed money to 5 families and saw a way to make the numbers say whatever he needed them to say. Nobody flew to Borneo. Nobody inspected the sample preparation facility. Nobody asked why the core handling was done in an open shed with no security protocols. Nobody put a camera in the room where the rock was crushed. Nobody compared the gold particle morphology to what should exist in a hard rock volcanic deposit. Nobody drilled a confirmation hole. For 4 years, the entire global mining industry valued a property at $70 billion based on laboratory results generated from tampered samples. And the tampering was done with a metal file and a bag of rings. The man who did it fell out of a helicopter 200 meters above the Borneo jungle. His body was found 4 days later. Some of the people who lost money believe he is still alive. The gold at Busang was always